We live in an era when no oppressed people will be satisfied to let the oppressor continue to oppress them without doing something about it.
It's mentioned that I am an activist within the railway union of the RMT, and I expected some aspect of that I maybe should cover, but I'm not going to either, because I think there's a deeper issue about what Paul brought to the international stage. There are important aspects to the trade union movement that he did, because what he did encourage participation within the movement, participation in workers' rights. And as has been said, when he came here, he came at a time when Welsh miners had been thrown out of their jobs and were basically destitute and had walked all the way to London, happened to be on the same night that he was performing. And what he did was he actually went out with them, fed them, because they hadn't been fed. Much like the Jara walkers, they had actually come on that journey, hopefully for charity on the way, but had not been fed. So he went out of his way to feed those comrades. Now, these are some, just touching on a few of the issues that he actually got involved in within trade union movement. The other thing is, obviously, and I don't know how many people knew this, he spent a great deal of time here in the UK. And when he was interviewed about that, because one of the things he said was so many people were running away from the racism of the South to the north of the US, or the United Snake, as Mwali likes to call it. And he had run so fast, or so far, that he left New York and he came to the UK. And of course, the racism here was here. It may have been more subtle, unlike it was so open and brazen in the US, but it was there to be seen. He mentioned that. But one of the things that he also mentioned, and when you hear him say it, you think maybe he was sort of looking ahead and sort of knew that this was going to happen, because the only thing he said was, I made sure I paid my tax in the UK. And I don't know whether he was thinking ahead, maybe Microsoft or Google were going to be in the same position that they hadn't paid their tax, and he decided that was something he had to say and make sure people understood. I think it was an American thing, because obviously you pay your taxes in America, they chase you up, and I dare say the FBI were there chasing him up, so he wanted to make sure that was very clear. But the point is, he was here and he made contribution. If you do, as I've done recently when I was asked to speak, do a little research and find some of the things that are available technologically of the things that he's done, you will find that he didn't come here and passively sit down or just perform in the theatre. It was an active part of activity here among other activists. Tony Benn, I think, made some very striking remarks about his activity. So he wasn't somebody who had actually sat back as a performance. And as it's been said, he used his opportunity, his position, his art to help the movement, to assist the civil rights movement in the US, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting situation that when he went back on the eve of war breaking out in Europe, he went back to the US and he assisted the state in its fight against fascism. He was continuing the work that he had been doing. He went to Spain during the fight against Franco. He assisted in many of the struggles that were taking place at that time. Now, in my trade union head office, if you go there, in the waiting room, you will see a plaque of all the NUR and seafaring comrades who volunteered and went to Spain and lost their lives. One of the things is not known, I think, to our members within the RMT, is the role that people like Robeson played in that struggle. Because his fight was against imperialism, his fight was against fascism, whichever way he could, and make that contribution. So people sometimes wonder, why go through this trouble of giving that assistance to the American state during that time? Because look what it did to him afterwards. When you hear of certain people, not Donald Trump apparently, being banned from coming or leaving the US, they took his passport away. Now, many people believe it was only the issue around whether he was a communist member or a card-carrying communist member during the McCarthy era. But what the official government document says, it was because of his involvement in anti-colonialist struggle. So in other words, they were saying, as an African living in the US, you have no right to pay any attention to what's happening in colonized parts of the world. And remember, American tell us they didn't have any colonies. So they were acting on behalf of European imperialists. And we have to make those connections and recognize those connections. The other thing I found interested in Robeson's life, and as you know, he was not only a musician, he was an actor. And I looked at one of his earlier movies, Borderland. It was a silent movie. But one extraordinary thing I found about it is, whilst he was the star, whoever was producing the movie felt it necessary, and I see this as nothing more than a warning, felt it necessary to put in the first caption the character he was playing, that he was a Negro, and his name. So in other words, it was important to warn those people who were going to watch it that who this person was. And it's extraordinary. I'm not saying it was a blockbuster by any means. I took the trouble to watch it through. But the reality is, in those days, whilst they were trying to sell us the dream that Africans were making it through these barriers, in essence, they were still creating a situation whereby try to create a veneer while continuing all of that. And remember, when Robeson was helping the US, and I consider this a contradiction, he knew that the lynching was going on. He knew that all of those things was going on, but felt at that time the importance of defeating fascism. Now, I don't know if historians will consider that to be a contradiction or something he shouldn't have done. Certainly Marcus Garvey challenged him around that and, say, why are we doing these things, etc., etc. The reality for him was that fighting against fascism was important. But that commitment, when that war ended, then turned to supporting communist Russia. And for that, the American took so much exception. Now, how does a nation completely forgot that a few years later, this person was part of the vanguard to fight against fascism? And it shows you the kind of contradiction that we've got to deal with. But the quote you make, comrade, about when he was asked, why don't you go back and live in Russia, is a quote and a demand for reparation. And we need to put that also on the record, because many people will start thinking, oh, it's just a new fad or something that's been started. He was saying to the American community, my ancestors, my people have paid blood and tears for what you have here. And I am going to stay and demand my portion of it and demand that reparation is paid. And we mustn't lose sight of that, because there was so much effort throughout history of trying to make those connections and make sure people understand. We're not saying by any means that there is no place that we should be seeking where we are. I believe that I will get involved in the struggle wherever I find myself. But it doesn't mean that my demand for justice will cease. I'm keeping my own time, comrades. I don't know if you want to indicate. I have just a few more things I want to say, because at the end of the day, I think the question for me or the historical context that I certainly want to put Paul in, is the fact that wherever you find yourself, it should never be a barrier to participate in the struggle that is around you. You must choose a side. And as he said at one point, you have to decide whether you are with the slavers or the enslaved. You must take a side. You must decide. And we're all in this struggle. We're all in this struggle. The chair of our Black Solidarity Committee is in the room, and I can say as a secretary, I will give this commitment because it is important that we make sure the history is kept alive. The time that Paul was here, the part that he played in so many other things. Now, as a union that's committed to fighting and exposing and educating on many of these issues, that this year, this 40th year, we have to make sure that more information about Paul is given out, and the connection between a plaque that we have on the wall of our union office that talks about those who have given their life to fight fascism in Spain, also linked to other contributions that are made. Because for me, when we talk about black heroes, when we talk about history, we must make sure that Paul, who paid a high price, because at one point he made it clear, had he been allowed, if it was a case of financial gain, had he been allowed to play some of the theatres in the US to much higher costs, to much higher reward, he would have been much richer. But he stood his ground, and he would never say, and he would never allow Congress. I mean, I wanted to ask George, whether, like Paul, when he stood in front of this committee, whether they wanted him to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else. Because it always seemed remarkable to me that you're talking to people who you're not really sure whether they've sworn that they will listen to the truth, the whole truth, and actually act on it. So, you know, you must use, if you do one thing when you leave here, you must try to use the technology that's available to us in this age to listen to some of those information and some of those historical documentation that are out there for perusal, because it will educate you about what you thought was just a very good singer. A singer, there's George on time, you missed my question. But a very good singer, a very important actor. He was clearly somebody who had actively been in part of the struggle and paid a high price for that. Comrade, obviously there will be a question and answer session afterwards, but I want to leave it there and say to you, thank you again for inviting me. But for me, Paul Robeson is a person who stands and shows that despite the cost, the demand on him, he is willing to make a contribution and pay, and we invite everyone to continue to do so. Thank you.